The wagon wheel was still spinning when Nora Chandler climbed down from the buckboard and walked straight through the front door of Joel Kendrick's ranch house like she owned the deed to every timber in it. She did not knock. She did not wait. She simply lifted the iron latch, pushed the heavy pine door open, and stepped inside with a worn leather saddlebag over one shoulder and a surveying transit slung across her back like a rifle. Joel Kendrick came out of the back room with a tin cup of coffee in his hand and murder in his eyes. "What in the world," he said slowly, "do you think you are doing in my house?" "Setting down my things," Nora said, and she did exactly that. Saddlebag hit the floor near the stone hearth. The transit case leaned against the wall with practiced care, like a woman who understood the value of precision instruments. Joel stared at her. He was a big man, wide through the shoulders, with hands like iron vices and a jaw set hard from years of biting back words he could not afford to say. He had not invited a soul into this house in 3 years. Not a neighbor, not a preacher, not the county land agent, not a woman, especially not a woman. "Miss Chandler," he said, and the fact that he knew her name was already a betrayal of something he had not meant to show. "I believe we had a conversation yesterday morning." "We did," she agreed. She was looking at his walls, at the land maps tacked crooked above the fireplace, at the dark stain on the ceiling where the roof had leaked before someone had repaired it badly. Her eyes moved the way a surveyor's eyes always moved, measuring, calculating, finding every flaw in a structure and storing it away. "I told you this ranch was no place for anyone else," Joel said. "I told you the life I lead out here is not a life I would ask anyone to share. I said those exact words." "You did," Nora said. She turned and looked at him fully then, and there was nothing soft in her face and nothing apologetic in her posture. She was 27 years old, sharp-boned and sun-dark from months in the field, with gray-green eyes that caught the morning light coming through the narrow window and made something complicated out of it. "You said you would never ask anyone. You are correct. You did not ask me. I did not wait to be asked." Joel Kendrick had faced down cattle stampedes and flash floods, and a man with a drawn pistol in the town of Laramie in the spring of 1882. He had never in all those confrontations been left temporarily without a single word to say. She used his silence efficiently. "I need 3 weeks," she said, already moving toward the back wall where his maps were. "Possibly 4. The survey contract I have been hired to complete requires access to this land and the ridge beyond it. The Territorial Land Office has authorized my survey. I have the papers in the bag." She glanced back at him. "Your nearest neighbor, Mr. Harlan Briggs, told me there was a boarding house in Caldwell Station. There is not. It burned in February. There is no hotel within 40 miles. Your barn is not suitable because of the predator problem you have not yet resolved in the eastern pasture, and sleeping in the open during this particular assignment would compromise both my equipment and my personal safety in ways that are not acceptable." She paused. "So I moved in," she said. "I will cook my own meals, wash my own clothes, and stay out of your way as thoroughly as the square footage of this structure permits. I will not ask you for anything. When the survey is complete, I will leave. You will not know I was here." Joel set down his coffee cup on the windowsill very carefully. "You," he said, "are the most remarkable piece of work I have ever encountered." "I have been called worse," Nora said pleasantly and turned back to his maps. That was how it began. And it was nothing at all like how either of them expected it to continue. To understand the hidden motive buried beneath Nora Chandler's extraordinary composure on that October morning in 1883, you have to understand who she had been before the Territorial Land Office of Wyoming gave her a contract and a transit, and sent her out into the high country alone. Nora had grown up in Philadelphia, which was the last place anyone looking at her sun-hardened face and competent hands would have guessed. Her father, Edmund Chandler, had been a civil engineer and a surveyor of some reputation, the kind of man who read German mathematics texts for pleasure and kept meticulous field journals that he eventually bound in dark green leather and lined up on a shelf above his desk. Her mother had died when Nora was 9, and Edmund Chandler, being a practical and somewhat unsentimental man, had simply brought Nora along to work rather than arrange a governess. By 12, she could read a compass bearing accurately. By 15, she was doing preliminary calculations for her father's field crew. By 19, when her father died of a heart failure that took him mid-sentence during a boundary dispute in Ohio, she knew the craft of surveying as well as any man holding a license in 3 territories. The problem, as the men of the profession were quick to point out, was that she was not a man. She was also not interested in becoming something closer to one in order to satisfy their discomfort, which made the situation between Nora Chandler and the professional world of 1880s surveying persistently contentious. She had spent 4 years fighting for contracts on her own terms. She had been cheated twice, underpaid 3 times, and once physically removed from a survey site by a ranch foreman who had not believed the papers she was carrying were legitimate. Each of those moments had left a layer of something hard and careful around her instincts, the way ice forms over a fast-moving river. The water still ran fast underneath. The surface just didn't show it anymore. The contract that had brought her to Joel Kendrick's land was large, the largest she had ever negotiated. The Northern Pacific Railroad's land agents needed a precise boundary survey of 3 sections of high-range territory in Carbon County, Wyoming, including the ridge that ran along the southeastern edge of the Kendrick spread. The survey would determine whether a proposed rail spur was viable and where exactly the legal property lines fell before the railroad made any purchase offers. Nora had won the contract in a sealed bid, outcompeting 2 licensed male surveyors from Cheyenne, and she was not about to let a shortage of lodgings or a stubborn rancher compromise the work she had spent her entire adult life building toward. Joel Kendrick was a different kind of story, and it was darker. He had come to Carbon County 7 years ago, at 25 with $300, a remuda of 6 horses, and a specific, driven purpose that had nothing romantic about it. He had spent the first 2 years breaking land, building fence, and establishing a cattle herd through the kind of labor that uses up a man down to his foundations, and then keeps asking. By the 3rd year he had a working ranch, not prosperous but functional, the sort of operation that could sustain itself if a man was willing to sacrifice everything outside the fence line to keep it alive. His dark past was not the dramatic kind. It was the slow, grinding kind. His family back in Kansas had lost their farm when Joel was 17, not to outlaws or disaster, but to debt and a dry season and a bank that had no interest in the difference between bad luck and bad management. His father had never recovered from it, not financially and not in any other way that mattered. His mother had worked herself to an early grave. His younger sister had married the first man who offered stability and spent the rest of her life in a small house in Abilene trying to convince herself she had made the right choice. Joel had taken every one of those lessons to heart, and the lesson he had extracted from all of them together was a single, sharp, forbidden-feeling truth. You did not bring someone else into a life you were not certain you could protect. You did not ask anyone to share a risk you could not guarantee. You did not hand someone the weight of your uncertainty and call it love. He had said it out loud precisely once, to a woman named Clara Estes in Laramie 3 years ago, a school teacher with a steady income and no illusions about romance. She had asked him plainly whether he saw a future with her, and he had told her the truth, that he would never ask anyone to share the hard life he led, that it would not be fair, that he refused to make that kind of promise when the land could turn on him any season and take everything he had built. Clara had thanked him for his honesty, and that had been the end of it, and the emptiness it left in him was something he had decided was appropriate and permanent. And then Nora Chandler walked through his door without being asked, set her saddlebag on his floor, and began studying his maps with the focused attention of someone who intended to understand every secret the land was keeping. The first 3 days were a negotiation conducted entirely without words. Joel did not ask her to leave again, partly because she had shown him the territorial land office authorization, and he understood legal reality, and partly because something in him, something he distrusted immediately, was reluctant to end the company. He made his own breakfast before dawn and was out with the cattle before she woke. She was gone most of each day on the ridge with her transit and her field journal, and a surveying rod she carried herself without complaint. She came back at dusk with mud on her boots and numbers in her head that she transcribed carefully by lamplight at the corner of his table. She asked for nothing. She cooked her own food using supplies she had brought in her buckboard. She heated her own wash water. She patched a hole in her boot with a piece of leather she produced from her kit and a needle and thread she carried herself. She was, as far as Joel could tell, the most aggressively self-sufficient human being he had ever shared a building with. It was infuriating and fascinating in equal measure. On the fourth day, a problem arrived that changed the geometry of everything. Joel came in from the eastern pasture at midday looking like a man carrying a trap on his back. Nora was at the table eating cold biscuits and reviewing field notes, and she looked up at his face and saw the trouble in it before he said a word. "The Harlan Briggs fence," Joel said, setting his hat on the peg by the door with the careful control of a man managing fury. "He has pushed it again, 3 more yards onto my land south of the creek bed. That is the second time this season." Nora set down her biscuit. "Where exactly?" "Along the south pasture line. He has done it gradually, a little at a time, hoping I would not notice or would not fight it. That land feeds my cattle through the late-season graze. I lose it, I lose the margin that keeps this operation alive through winter." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What is your recorded boundary for that section?" Joel looked at her. "What?" "Your deed, the legal description of the southern boundary. What does it say?" He went to the shelf above the fireplace and found the deed among the papers there, a folded document recorded at the Carbon County Courthouse in 1876. He spread it on the table. Nora read it. Her eyes moved quickly, then stopped. Then she reached for her field journal and opened it to a page covered in figures. "I ran survey lines along that creek yesterday," she said. "Not for your property. My authorization is for the ridge sections, but I run baseline measurements out of habit whenever I am working in a new area. It helps me establish control points." She tapped the journal. "Your legal boundary is at the second bend in the creek, not the first. That is approximately 40 feet further south than where Briggs has put his fence." Joel stared at the numbers. "You can prove that. I can rerun the line formally in about 4 hours if you want a document you can take to the county land agent." She looked up at him. "Would you like me to?" He was quiet for a long moment, and in that moment something shifted in his face that he was not entirely in control of. He was a man who had spent 7 years solving every problem on this land with his own hands and his own determination, and here was a woman sitting at his table who had, in the course of doing her own unrelated work, accidentally generated the exact evidence he needed to defend what he had built. "I would," he said, and his voice came out quieter than he intended. That afternoon they walked the south pasture together for the first time. It was the first time Joel had been close to her outside the house, close enough to see how she worked, and what he saw reorganized something in his understanding of her that had not been organized correctly before. She set up her transit with a speed and precision that made his hands feel clumsy just to watch. She read angles, dictated numbers to herself, moved the surveying rod to each control point with a certainty that was not the certainty of someone guessing, but the certainty of someone who understood the mathematical architecture beneath the surface of the land. She did not hesitate. She did not second-guess. She worked the way a master craftsman works, with the kind of quiet authority that comes from understanding your tools so thoroughly they become an extension of thought. At one point she called him over to look through the transit eyepiece and explained exactly what he was seeing: the angle, the distance, the relationship between the numbers and the physical location of the boundary. She spoke to him the way she would have spoken to a professional colleague. No condescension, no oversimplification. Simply clear and direct, and assuming he was capable of understanding if she explained it well. He understood, and the understanding hit him with a specific, unexpected force. Nobody had explained anything to Joel Kendrick with that quality of intellectual respect in a very long time. People told him what to do, what they wanted, what they needed. They did not typically assume he wanted to understand the underlying architecture of a problem. By the time Nora drove her final stake into the south pasture and declared the boundary line officially documented, the October sun was going red over the western ridge, and Joel had said very little for 2 hours. He was watching her pack the transit away with her careful hands, and he was in the middle of a feeling he did not have a name for yet, but which was beginning to alarm him. "I will write up the formal field notes tonight," she said, closing the instrument case. "You can take them to the county seat Monday if you want to file a formal complaint against Briggs. That will be enough to move him back. It will be enough to take him to court if he refuses," she said. "And since the legal description is unambiguous and my measurements will be signed and sealed, he will not want to go to court. He will move the fence." She picked up the case and the rod and started back toward the house, and Joel fell into step beside her. "Miss Chandler," he said after they had walked about 50 yards in silence. "Nora," she said. He took a breath. "Nora. Why are you out here doing this alone?" She did not slow her stride. "Because I am the best surveyor available for this contract and I needed the work." "That is not what I mean." She was quiet for a few steps. The red light was spreading across the grass, turning it the color of old copper, and somewhere in the distance one of the horses was calling out for its evening feed. The land smelled like cold coming, like the first serious frost was 3 or 4 days out. "I know what you mean," she said finally. "You mean why is a woman doing this without a husband or a father or a business partner, or any of the structures that are supposed to make it comprehensible to the people watching? And the answer is because I understand this work better than most people holding a license, because I need to eat, and because I have never found any of those structures more reliable than my own competence." Joel was quiet. Then he said, "That is a hard way to live." "So I have heard," she said, and there was something in her tone that landed differently than he expected, not defensively, not bitterly, but with the kind of dry, clear-eyed acknowledgement that comes from someone who has thought something all the way through and made her peace with the conclusion. They ate dinner at the same table that night for the first time. Neither of them had planned it. She had cooked extra beans and cornbread without comment and set a second plate on the table, and Joel had sat down and eaten without making it a point, and they had talked about the land, about the railroad survey, about the geology of the ridge above the property, and the conversation had gone on longer than either of them intended. Over the next week and a half, a pattern developed that had the deceptive quality of something accidental, even though, if either of them had examined it honestly, it was becoming quite deliberate. Joel began timing his return from the eastern pasture to coincide with Nora's return from the ridge. He told himself it was because he liked to hear what she had found up there, which was true but incomplete. Nora began making enough dinner for 2 every evening, which she explained to herself as efficient use of fuel, which was also true and also incomplete. They talked. That was the thing neither of them had been prepared for. They talked with the particular, accelerating pleasure of 2 people who have been intellectually hungry for a long time and have suddenly found something substantial to eat. They talked about the railroad and its effect on the territory, about the tensions between the cattle ranchers and the incoming homesteaders, about the legal frameworks that were trying to manage the chaos of Western expansion and largely failing. Nora had opinions that were precise and well-sourced. Joel had observations that were grounded in 7 years of direct experience with the land and the people on it. The combination was, for both of them, like water in a dry month. One evening, 10 days after her arrival, they were sitting on the porch after dinner, which had also become a pattern that neither had proposed and both had accepted. The temperature had dropped with the full autumn settlement, and there was a sharpness in the air that made the stars over the ridge look cut rather than merely visible. "You have never done this before," Joel said. "Done what?" "Moved yourself into a situation nobody invited you into." Nora looked at the stars for a moment. "Once," she said. "I submitted a bid for a survey contract in Nebraska in 1880. The land agent told me they did not award contracts to women. I went to his supervisor. His supervisor told me the same thing. I found the man who actually held the authority over the decision, which took me 2 weeks of investigation, and I showed him my credentials and my father's credentials and the relevant sections of the territorial contract law, which made no provision for exclusion based on sex, and I stood in his office until he either awarded me the contract or called the marshal. He awarded me the contract." Joel made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one. "Did you complete it?" he asked. "To a higher standard than the previous surveyor had managed," she said. "He knew it too. He hired me twice more after that." She paused. "That is when I understood that the word no is frequently the beginning of a negotiation rather than the end of one." Joel turned to look at her in the dark. The lamplight from the window behind them caught the side of her face, the set of her jaw, the particular quality of her attention as she looked out over the land. He thought clearly and with some alarm, "I am in serious trouble." What he said was, "There is a problem developing with the northern herd that I have not been able to solve." She turned to look at him. "The cattle have been drifting away from the north pasture," he said. "2 weeks running. I cannot find a reason for it. No predator sign I can identify, no obvious problem with the water or the grass, but something up there is wrong and I have not found it." "What does the terrain look like north of the pasture?" "Rocky flats, then a limestone shelf about a quarter mile in. There is a seasonal creek that runs through a cut in the shelf, dry this time of year." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Is there any mining activity in the area? Abandoned shafts, old diggings?" Joel frowned. "There was some placer prospecting years back. I never paid it much attention." "Hydrogen sulfide," she said. "It can vent from old mine workings, sometimes through limestone formations. It is heavier than air, settles in low areas. Animals can smell it at very low concentrations, well below what a person would notice, and they will avoid the area without any visible reason. It would match the behavior you are describing." Joel stared at her. "How do you know that?" "My father surveyed around abandoned mining operations for most of a decade. He had 3 crew members become ill from gas exposure before anyone understood what was happening. After that, he studied the problem very thoroughly, and he made sure I understood it too." She looked at him steadily. "You should check the creek cut and any low areas near the shelf. If there is venting, you will want to check it early morning when the air is still. Do not go alone." There was a moment of silence in which Joel Kendrick, a man who had built a cattle operation from nothing and survived 7 Wyoming winters on his own judgment, recognized that he had just been told something critical about his own land by a woman who had been on it for 11 days. He was not diminished by it. That was the thing that surprised him. He was not embarrassed or defensive. He was simply, profoundly, and inconveniently impressed. "I will check it Monday morning," he said. "Would you come?" She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, something small and careful, like a door opened a precise half-inch. "Yes," she said, "I will come." The gas venting was exactly where Nora had predicted, in the shallow cut along the dry creek bed where the limestone shelf dipped toward a depression full of dead grass and one small, stiff bird. Joel found it on Monday morning with Nora watching from upwind as she had instructed, and the evidence was unmistakable once you knew what you were looking at. He fenced the area off that afternoon with cedar posts and wire, and within 3 days the northern herd had returned to the pasture. What the incident did to the dynamic between them was not something either could have fenced off as efficiently. Joel began to understand, with the specific clarity that only honest men arrive at when they stop arguing with evidence, that he was looking at Nora Chandler differently than he had looked at anyone in a very long time. The feeling had texture and weight. It had the quality of something that had been growing in the dark and had now reached a point where it required light whether or not he was ready to provide it. He handled this the way he handled most inconvenient truths, by working harder and talking less. Nora, for her part, was conducting her own interior negotiation. She had not come to Joel Kendrick's ranch looking for anything but a place to sleep and access to the land she needed to survey. She had come with her defenses in their standard configuration, calibrated by years of experience with men who either underestimated her or wanted something from her or both. She had expected Joel Kendrick to be hostile, dismissive, or condescending. He had been none of those things. He had been, after the first day's shock, quietly and steadily respectful. He asked her questions that assumed she had something worth hearing. He listened to her answers with the full attention of someone who intended to use the information. When she corrected his understanding of the survey data, he did not bristle or deflect. He simply adjusted. And he was, she admitted to herself on the 13th night while lying on the cot she had set up near the fireplace, a spectacularly difficult man to remain unmoved by. Not because of his face or his broad shoulders, though she was not unaware of either, but because of the particular quality of his silence, the way he stood in his land as if he had grown out of it, the way he worked with a care and intensity that suggested the ranch was not just property to him, but something closer to a promise he was keeping. She had been around men who worked hard. She had not often been around men who worked with that quality of private devotion. It alarmed her nearly as much as it drew her in. The crisis arrived on the 16th day, which was a Tuesday, and it arrived in the form of Harlan Briggs driving his wagon up to Joel's front yard with 2 hired men in the bed, and a look on his face that said he had decided negotiation was for people without hired men. Joel was at the barn. Nora was on the porch reviewing field notes. Briggs pulled up short when he saw her, because he had not known anyone was staying at the Kendrick place, and the sight of a woman on the porch recalculated something in his approach. He was a broad, red-faced man in his 50s with the kind of certainty that comes from having gotten away with things for a long time. "Who are you?" he said from the wagon. "Nora Chandler," she said, "Territorial Land Office Survey Contractor. You are Mr. Briggs, I assume." Briggs's eyes went to the survey case leaning against the porch rail. Something shifted in his expression, a recalculation happening behind his eyes that was not entirely clean. "I am here to talk to Kendrick," he said. "He will be out in a moment," Nora said. She did not move from the porch rail. "While you wait, I can tell you that the formal survey documentation for the South Pasture boundary will be filed at the Carbon County seat on Friday. The line is located at the Second Creek Bend, as the original deed specifies. Your fence is currently sitting 41 feet into Mr. Kendrick's legal property." Briggs stared at her. "Those are not my calculations," she continued pleasantly. "Those are the calculations of the original land survey, recorded in 1876, which I have simply verified. You are welcome to hire your own surveyor to dispute the measurements. I am confident in them." Joel came around the corner of the barn at that moment and read the scene in about 3 seconds. He came forward and stood just below the porch, and the combination of his physical presence and Nora's documentation formed a wall that Briggs could see would not be worth trying to knock down. There was a short, ugly conversation in which Briggs made some threatening sounds about lawyers and about people from the land office who had no business poking around in private property disputes. Nora let Joel handle the conversation, but she remained visible, and she answered 2 direct questions Briggs put to her about the survey documentation with a precision that made it clear she knew exactly what she was talking about and had no anxiety about proving it in court. Briggs left without the confrontation he had arrived intending to have. When his wagon was out of sight, Joel turned around and looked up at Nora on the porch. "You held your ground," he said. "I had the numbers," she said. Numbers are better than ground. He looked at her for a long moment in the afternoon light. This woman who had arrived uninvited, and in the space of 16 days had documented his property boundary, identified a gas hazard in his north pasture, and just now calmly deflated a man twice her size and 3 decades more practiced at intimidation, all with nothing but a transit, a field journal, and a competence so thorough it had become its own kind of authority. He said, "Nora," she looked at him. "I owe you a debt I am not sure how to pay," he said. "You do not owe me anything," she said. "I solved my own lodging problem and incidentally solved 2 of yours. That is not debt, that is proximity." He shook his head, but he was almost smiling, and it was the kind of almost that had more weight than most actual smiles. That evening, something broke open. They were at the table after dinner, and the conversation had moved through cattle prices and railroad politics and arrived, by some path that neither of them had quite planned, at the question of what each of them wanted. Not from the survey, not from the ranch, from life. From whatever came after the work was done. Joel was quiet for a long time after she asked him. The lamp was burning low on the table between them, and outside the wind had come up with the kind of October authority that said winter was no longer a threat but a certainty. "I wanted to build something that lasted," he said finally. "Something that nobody could take from me the way the bank took the farm from my father. That has been the point of all of it. And have you?" "I do not know yet," he said. "It takes decades to know if a thing lasts." Nora was quiet for a moment. "What else did you want?" He looked at her directly, and there was no pretense in his face. "What I wanted and what I decided I could responsibly pursue have not always been the same list." "The woman in Laramie," Nora said. Joel's eyes changed. "How do you know about that?" "Your neighbor Mrs. Holt mentioned it when I was asking around for lodgings. She said you were a good man who had decided the hard life you led was not something you would ask anyone to share." Nora's voice was even. She said it was the saddest practical decision she had ever heard of. Joel was silent. "I did not tell you this earlier," Nora said, "because it was not my business and I did not want you to think I was here for any reason other than the survey. Are you here for any other reason?" The question hung in the air between them, and Nora looked at him with that precise, measuring quality, the same quality she brought to a compass bearing or a boundary stake, and said, "I was not when I arrived." The silence after that was different from the silences that had come before. It had weight and heat, and the particular quality of a moment that both people in it understood cannot be uncrossed once crossed. Joel stood up from the table and walked to the window. He looked out at the dark land for a while. The wind was moving the dry grass in long, silver waves under the moon, and the ridge above the property was a black line against a sky full of cold stars. "I meant what I said," he said without turning around. "I meant every word of it. This life is hard. This land is not forgiving. There are seasons when I am not certain this ranch will survive to the next one, and I have not been willing to ask someone to stand in the middle of that uncertainty with me." "Joel," Nora said. He turned. "I have been standing in the middle of uncertainty for my entire adult life," she said. "Not your uncertainty, mine. I have built my livelihood one contract at a time in a profession that would prefer I did not exist. I have slept in wagon beds and borrowed rooms, and once in a surveyor's tent in a Nebraska hailstorm. I have done it alone by choice because I have not trusted anyone to stand in it with me either." She paused. "I am not looking to be saved from the hard life. I am already living one." Joel looked at her for a long time. "That is either the most persuasive thing anyone has ever said to me," he said slowly, "or the most dangerous." "Probably both," she said. He crossed the room to where she was sitting, and she stood up because she had always preferred to meet things at eye level, and he stopped close enough that the lamp between them was no longer between them. "I do not know how to do this carefully," he said. "I have spent 3 years making sure I did not have to try." "I know," she said. "Neither do I. I have spent longer than that." There was a moment, suspended and complete, in which everything that had been building since a wagon wheel spun in the October morning, and a woman walked through an unlocked door reached its natural consequence. Joel Kendrick kissed Nora Chandler with the particular, restrained intensity of a man who has been holding something at a controlled distance for a long time and has finally, definitively, let it go. Nora, who had spent years measuring distances and angles and precise locations, found that some things could not be measured and did not need to be. What happened next was not simple. Nothing between two people who have each built such specific, defended lives ever collapses into simplicity without some effort and some fear. The morning after the kiss, Joel was already out with the cattle before Nora woke. She understood the retreat for what it was, the reflex of someone whose dark past had trained him to recoil from anything that felt like a promise he might not be able to keep. She did not chase it. She drank her coffee and picked up her field journal and went to work on the ridge, because the survey contract still needed completing and she was, above all else, a professional. When Joel came back at midday, he found a note on the table in Nora's precise handwriting. Northern boundary line confirmed. Ridge elevation data collected. Approximately 5 days remaining for completion of contract. Dinner at dusk and nothing else. No demand, no confrontation, no pressure. He sat down with the note and something in his chest did a complicated thing. That evening she was already at the stove when he came in, and she turned and looked at him with the clear, composed attention that was simply her face, not performing anything, not concealing anything. "I owe you an explanation," he said. "You do not," she said. "I know what happened. You woke up in the morning and remembered all the reasons you made the decision you made 3 years ago. You are not wrong about those reasons. They are real reasons." "They are," he said, "and they are also," he stopped. "Also," she said, "also the kind of reasons a man uses to protect himself from something he wants badly enough to be afraid of it," he said, "which is a different thing than a good reason." Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, it is." They ate dinner and the conversation was careful and honest in a way that felt, to both of them, like surveying new ground, measuring each other's actual coordinates rather than the ones they had assumed from a distance. Joel talked about the fear in a way he had not talked about anything private to another person in years. The fear of repeating his father's failure. The fear of building something and watching it go. The specific, corrosive fear of being responsible for someone else's unhappiness in a life that was not built with excess margin. Nora listened with the full, unhurried attention she gave to everything important. When he had finished, she said, "You are describing a man who took every wrong thing that happened to people he loved and decided it was evidence of his own incapacity. That is not what the evidence shows. What does the evidence show? That you built a working ranch in 7 years from $300 and determination. That you maintained it through drought and predator loss, and a neighbor who has been stealing your land by degrees for 2 years. That you identified a problem in the North Pasture and resolved it within 4 days of receiving new information. That is not a man who cannot be trusted with things that matter." She looked at him steadily. "That is a man who has been afraid to let himself know that." The silence that followed was the longest they had shared, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people arriving, after a long, separate journey, at the same location. 2 days later, the Harlan Briggs problem escalated in a way that forced everything else to the side. Briggs had not moved his fence. Instead, he had gone to the county seat and filed a competing claim, alleging that the original 1876 survey had contained an error, and that his property line extended to the first creek bend, not the second. It was a legal tactic, slow and expensive, and designed to exhaust rather than resolve, and it required Nora to appear before the county land agent with her documentation before she had finished the railroad survey. She went on Thursday with her field notes and her transit readings and her sealed calculations, and Joel drove her the 40 miles to Rawlins in the buckboard, because the roads were rough and the transit needed careful transport. They drove those 40 miles mostly in conversation, and the conversation had the quality of people who have begun to understand each other well enough to disagree productively. They argued pleasantly about the railroad's effect on the territory, about the legal structures governing land claims, about whether the federal homestead policies were a net benefit to the people they were supposed to serve. Nora had strong opinions, backed by specifics. Joel had experience, backed by 7 years of watching policy land in the actual dirt of actual land. At the county seat, the land agent was a thin man named Purvis who clearly had not expected the claimant to be a woman, and who made his discomfort visible in approximately 15 ways before Nora finished laying her documentation on his desk. She presented her case with the same quality she brought to everything, methodical, precise, and utterly without apology. She walked Purvis through the original deed language, the relationship between the legal description and the physical boundary markers, her own survey measurements, and the mathematical impossibility of Briggs's competing claim given the elevation data for the creek bed. She used no dramatic gestures and no elevated voice. She simply laid the truth out in the organized sequence it required, and the truth was, as it generally is when it has been measured carefully, quite difficult to argue with. Purvis sat back in his chair at the end of it and was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Briggs will dispute the measurements," he said. "He is welcome to hire a surveyor," Nora said. "I am confident in the measurements. It may come to a formal hearing." "Then I will be at the formal hearing," she said, "with the original transit, the field notes, and, if necessary, a mathematics professor from the University of Wyoming who can verify the calculations. The boundary is where the deed says it is, Mr. Purvis. There is no alternative version of the survey data that changes that." Purvis looked at her for a moment, then at Joel, then back at Nora. "I will send Briggs a notice that his competing claim requires substantiation," he said. "If he cannot produce a competing survey within 60 days, the original boundary stands." Nora accepted this, and they left the county seat. On the drive back, as the light went golden and long over the Wyoming flats and the horses moved at a steady, unhurried walk, Joel said, "You have done that before. Walked into a room where nobody wanted you there and made them acknowledge the truth anyway." "Many times," she said. "Does it ever wear on you?" She was quiet for a while. "Yes," she said, "more than I let show. There is a kind of loneliness in it, always being the person who has to be twice as prepared and twice as certain, because the room will not give you the benefit of any doubt." She looked out at the land. "My father prepared me for the work. He prepared me very well. He did not entirely prepare me for what it would feel like to do the work in a world that preferred I did not." Joel was quiet. Then he said, "For what it is worth, and I understand it may not be worth much coming from a member of the world that preferred you did not, I think the world has been conducting a serious error of judgment." Nora turned and looked at him, and what happened in her face in that moment was not dramatic. It was small and real, and it went all the way down. "It is worth something," she said, "more than you might expect." They arrived back at the ranch after dark, and the house was cold, and they built up the fire together, and neither of them went to their respective sleeping arrangements as early as they had before Thursday. With 5 days left on the contract, the railroad survey consumed Nora's days with the full pressure of approaching completion. The final measurements on the ridge were technically demanding, requiring triangulation from 3 separate stations to establish the precise elevation and position data the railroad engineers needed. She worked from first light to near dark, and Joel, on the second and third of those days, found reasons to ride up toward the ridge in the late afternoon, ostensibly to check the fence line along the eastern boundary. He watched her work from a respectful distance. He watched the way she moved through the terrain with the confidence of someone who understood what the land was actually made of beneath its surface, not just what it looked like from horseback. He watched her make decisions about station placement with a speed that suggested she had already calculated 3 possibilities and selected the optimal one before anyone else would have finished deciding where to set the tripod. On the third afternoon, she looked up from the transit and found him sitting on his horse about 100 yards away, and she did not say anything about it, but when she came down from the ridge at dusk, her almost smile was a full one. "You have been watching me work," she said. "I have," he said, and he made no attempt to pretend otherwise. And I have never," he said carefully, "in my life seen anyone do anything with that quality of, I do not know the right word for it. Certainty that is not arrogance, mastery that is not performance. Competence," she said. "More than that," he said. She looked at him in the fading light, the transit case in her hand and mud on her boots and her hair coming loose from its pins after a long day on the ridge, and Joel Kendrick thought she was the most extraordinary person he had ever stood near. He did not say that. Instead he said, "Come down, I cooked dinner." She stopped. "You cooked dinner?" "I do know how," he said, slightly defensive. "I have been cooking my own food for 7 years." "I did not say you did not know how," she said. "I said you cooked dinner. That is the first time since I arrived that you have been the one to cook." "It seemed like the right occasion," he said. "What occasion?" "You are almost finished," he said, and there was something in his voice that was not quite steady. "A few more days." The thing he had not let himself say for days was sitting exactly at the surface of that sentence, and they both heard it. Nora walked toward him, and he leaned down from the saddle, and she looked up at him against the last red light of the October sky. "I have been thinking," she said. "About the survey." "About what comes after the survey," she said. "About whether it is possible to finish a contract and not leave the site. Whether those are actually different categories, contractually speaking." Joel felt something in his chest do the complicated thing again, only this time it did not tighten into fear. It opened. "I do not believe those are regulated by the Territorial Land Office," he said. "No," she said. "I believe those are strictly personal jurisdiction." He held out his hand, and she took it, and he helped her up onto the horse behind him, and they rode down from the ridge together through the dying October light with the ranch spread out below them like a thing that had been waiting. The last 2 days of the survey went quickly. Nora completed the ridge measurements, ran her final calculations by lamplight at the kitchen table, and produced a survey document that was, as everything she produced was, precise and complete and absolutely defensible. She sealed it in the tube provided by the railroad company's land agent and wrote the cover letter in the careful, formal language of a professional report. On the last evening of the formal contract, she and Joel sat on the porch for a long time in the cold, wrapped in coats against the November that was beginning to press in from the north. "The contract ends tomorrow," he said. "It does," she said. "I said when you arrived," he began. "You said you would never ask anyone to share the hard life you led," she said. "I know, I remember. I meant it," he said, "when I said it. I know that too. The thing I am finding," he said slowly, choosing his words with the care of someone who does not use many words and therefore needs them to be accurate, "is that there is a difference between asking someone to share a hard life, which I will not do because it is not a fair thing to ask, and acknowledging that someone has already been sharing a hard life of their own, and that the question of whether those 2 hard lives might be, I am looking for the right word." "Compatible," she offered. "Better together," he said. "That is closer." Nora looked out at the dark land for a long moment. The stars were very bright over the ridge, the same ridge she had spent 3 weeks measuring, the same land she had walked and studied and come to know in the specific, intimate way of someone who has been asked to understand its exact dimensions. "Joel," she said, "I did not move into your house because I was looking for a husband or a protector or anything that required an invitation. I moved in because I needed a place to work from and there was no alternative, and I had the legal authorization and the nerve to do it. Those are the true reasons." "I know," he said. "And in the course of being here," she continued, "I found, somewhat to my alarm, that the man whose house I moved into without permission was the first person in a very long time who looked at what I do and saw it for what it is instead of what he wished it were." She paused. "That is not a small thing. In my particular life, that is not a small thing at all." Joel turned to look at her. "I am not finished," she said, and there was a warmth in her voice now beneath the precision, something coming through the carefully managed surface. "I also found that I liked the way you moved through your own land. I liked the way you listened. I liked the way you were shocked when I told you things you did not know, and instead of defending against the shock, you simply took the information and used it. I liked," she stopped for a moment, "I liked the way you looked at me on the ridge like I was something worth riding 40 minutes uphill to see." He was very still. "I am not asking you to ask me anything," she said. "I have told you I do not wait for invitations. But I want you to know that when you are ready, when you are actually ready and not just managing fear in the direction of readiness, I am not going anywhere. I have a perfectly good field base of operations right here." Joel was quiet for so long that the night sound settled back in around them, the wind moving through the dry grass, the distant sound of the horses in the barn, the particular silence of a high Wyoming night that has nothing soft about it. Then he said, "I am ready." She turned to look at him. "I have been afraid," he said. "I have been afraid for 3 years in a way I dressed up to look like integrity. And I think the honest thing, since we appear to be doing honest things, is to say that I do not believe this is really about what is fair to ask. I think it has been about being afraid to try again and fail." He paused. "And I think the honest thing is to say that you are the first person since I built this ranch that I have been afraid to lose." Nora looked at him. Something in her face that had been managed and careful since the first morning she walked through his door came fully, simply undone. "Then do not lose me," she said. He moved toward her and she toward him, and the second kiss they shared had none of the restraint of the first one. It was full and present and held nothing back, like two people who have finally arrived at a truth they have been triangulating from a distance, and have now, at last, driven the stake into the actual ground. The cold did not seem particularly relevant after that. Winter came to Carbon County with the seriousness it reserved for that particular altitude and latitude, which is to say it came fully and without apology. The snow arrived in early November and stayed, and the ranch pulled in on itself the way it did every year, becoming its own contained world of feeding and watering and fence checking, and the long, dark evenings by the fire that were the winter's one consistent mercy. Nora Chandler did not leave. She sent her completed survey report to the railroad company's agent in Cheyenne by post and received a bank draft in return. That was the largest single payment of her professional career. She wrote formal letters to 3 potential clients for spring survey work. She reviewed her father's field journals, which she had brought in the saddlebag, and made notes in the margins in her own precise hand. She also, with Joel's full knowledge and collaboration, began to understand the ranch in the way that only sustained presence generates. She learned the daily rhythms, the particular needs of the different sections of the herd, the way the eastern fence behaved in freeze-thaw cycles, the specific personalities of the horses in Joel's remuda. She was useful in ways she had not been hired to be useful and made no performance of it. Joel, for his part, was in the process of renegotiating the foundational terms of how he understood his own life, which is a disorienting renovation to undertake in the middle of Wyoming winter, but he found it substantially less frightening than he had expected. The fear had not disappeared, but it had been recontextualized, the way a dark room is recontextualized when someone brings a lamp into it. The room is the same size. The contents are the same. The darkness is simply no longer the dominant fact. He asked her to marry him in January, on a Sunday morning when the snow was deep against the south wall of the house, and the fire was going strong, and Nora was at the table with her father's journal and a cup of coffee, wearing one of Joel's wool coats over her dress, because the mornings were cold even with the fire. He had not planned a speech. He had spent a week thinking about whether to plan a speech and had arrived at the conclusion that Nora Chandler would find a prepared speech less credible than the unprepared truth. So he simply set down the coffee he was carrying and said, "Nora, I want to ask you something." She looked up from the journal. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not for the winter and not until the next contract comes through. I want you to stay in the way that requires papers and a preacher and a legal record. I want, if you are willing, to share whatever this is with you. The hard parts and the other parts." He paused. "I am not asking you to give up your work. I am not asking you to become something other than what you are. I am asking if you want to build something here with me that belongs to both of us." Nora looked at him for a long moment, and her expression was the full one, nothing managed, nothing held back. "Joel," she said. "Yes." "You just asked someone to share the hard life you lead," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then slowly, something broke open in his face that was the closest she had ever seen him come to a full, uncomplicated smile. "I suppose I did." "Good," she said. It was time. She stood up and crossed the room to where he was standing and put her hands on either side of his face, because she had been wanting to do that since somewhere around the 14th day and saw no reason to delay any further, and she said yes without using the word at all. They were married in February in the town of Rawlins, in front of the county clerk and 2 witnesses they borrowed from the street, which suited both of them considerably better than the alternative of a large production that neither of them had the personality to survive with grace. Nora wore her best dress, which was dark green wool, and Joel wore a jacket that had been hanging in the closet for 3 years and fit him as well as it ever had. The ceremony took 11 minutes and was entirely legal and binding, which were the qualities Nora had specified as essential. The county clerk, whose name was Henderson, looked at Nora when she signed the register and said, "Are you the Chandler that did the boundary survey on the Briggs-Kendrick dispute?" "I am," she said. "Briggs withdrew his competing claim last week," Henderson said. "Couldn't find a surveyor willing to dispute your measurements." "I did not expect he would find one," Nora said. Henderson looked at her with a respect that was uncomplicated and genuine. "Good work," he said. "Thank you," she said, and signed her name as Nora Kendrick for the first time with the particular, considered signature of someone who has chosen a thing deliberately and intends to stand behind it. Spring came to Carbon County the way it always did, with a violence that was also a mercy, the ice breaking and the ground coming back to life in that chaotic rush that makes everything feel both possible and dangerous at the same time. Nora's spring survey contracts arrived. She had 3 of them, 2 for private landholders filing homestead claims and 1 for the County Road Commission, which needed precise elevation data for a road extension north of Rawlins. She organized her field schedule around the ranch's needs, which were different in spring than in winter, and she and Joel negotiated the logistics of this with the practical, collaborative efficiency that had come to characterize everything they did together. She rode out on survey days with her transit packed on the second horse of the pair Joel had insisted she take from his remuda, a steady gray gelding named Atlas who had enough sense to stand perfectly still while she was working. Joel did not worry about her on the road, not because he lacked concern for her safety, which he had in considerable measure, but because he had learned, through direct and repeated evidence, that Nora Chandler's judgment about risk was at least as good as his own, and her self-sufficiency was something he respected too thoroughly to insult with unnecessary anxiety. In April, Nora realized she was expecting a child. She told Joel on a Tuesday evening, directly and without preamble, because she was not a woman who approached significant information indirectly. Joel went very still for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I am entirely well," she said. He crossed the room and took her hands, and the expression on his face was something she had not seen before, something that had gone past the calm competence and the managed private fear to something raw and open and very deep. "Nora," he said, and her name in his voice at that particular moment had a quality it had not had before. "The work continues as normal until it does not," she said, "at which point I will modify accordingly. I expect to complete the Road Commission contract before July, which gives us adequate time before November. The birth will be attended by Dr. Maria Reyes in Rawlins, who delivered 17 babies last year and has an excellent reputation. Joel was looking at her with that open, undone expression. "You have already arranged for the doctor," he said. "I arranged it this morning," she said. "I stopped in Rawlins on my way back from the Northern Claim Steak." He put his arms around her, which he did not often do in the kitchen in the ordinary middle of an ordinary evening, and held her with the specific, concentrated care of a man who has something he values enormously and is allowing himself, for the first time in his life, to know it. "I am afraid," he said into her hair. "I know," she said. "So am I that is allowed." "Are we ready for this?" he said. "We are competent and willing, and we have a working water supply and a doctor arranged and enough firewood for 2 winters," she said. "Nobody is ever fully ready for this, but those are solid operational conditions." He held her for another moment, and against his chest she felt him breathe out the fear in that particular long, slow way that means a person has decided to put it down. "A boy or a girl?" he said, not really a question, just the wondering aloud. "Either would be welcome," she said. "Yes," he said, "either." The summer was the best of Joel's 7 on the ranch, and he knew it while he was in it, which he understood was a gift not everyone received. The cattle operation was strong. The boundary dispute had been formally resolved in his favor when Briggs withdrew his competing claim, and the northern pasture was fully restored with the gas hazard fenced, and the herd grazing contentedly in the sections they had avoided all winter. He had also, for the first time in 7 years, someone to come home to. That was the simplest description of what had changed, and also the most complete one. The house that had been an operational base, a place to sleep and eat between one day's work and the next, had become something else. It had become the specific, irreplaceable location of a life that belonged to 2 people who had each, separately, been in the business of surviving, and had discovered, somewhat to their mutual surprise, that they were better at everything when they were not doing it alone. Nora's presence had changed the house in practical ways. Her books on the shelf beside his, her instruments stored with care in the corner she had claimed on the first morning, her field journals in a neat stack that grew through the summer as she completed survey after survey, and built her professional reputation in Carbon County, to the point where the county commissioner had asked her to appear at a public meeting to present data on the proposed road extension. She had appeared and presented and answered questions with the clear, unflinching competence that was simply her nature, and Joel had sat in the back of the meeting room and watched the room recognize what he had known since the South Pasture survey in October, which was that Nora Chandler was the most capable person in most rooms she entered, and made no apology for it. He had driven home afterward with a feeling in his chest that was uncomplicated pride, the rare, clean kind that has no envy in it, the kind that comes from watching someone you love be exactly who they are. In October, a year from the October that had started everything, Nora gave birth to a boy. He was born on a Sunday, healthy and large, and entirely disinclined to cooperate with the timeline Nora had established for the event, arriving a week early in the way that suggested he might have inherited his mother's habit of acting without waiting for a formal invitation. Dr. Reyes attended, as arranged, and Joel was present for all of it in the particular white-knuckled state of a man who understands that there are situations entirely outside his ability to solve and can do nothing but witness and hope. When it was over and Reyes had declared everything as it should be, and the baby was in Nora's arms and Nora was exhausted but entirely herself, Joel sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the 2 of them with the expression of a man who has arrived, after a long journey by a difficult road, at a destination that turned out to be better than he had allowed himself to imagine. "What do you want to name him?" Joel said. "Edmund," she said. "For my father." She paused. "If that suits you." "Edmund Kendrick," Joel said. He tried the name. "Yes, that is a good name." Edmund Kendrick was, from his first days, as opinionated and direct as his mother, and as quietly stubborn as his father, which everyone who met him agreed was either an excellent combination or a formidable problem, depending on your relationship to it. He grew into himself in the way children do on working ranches, with the land as his first and most thorough teacher, and Nora carried him on her survey rounds in a sling across her chest when he was small enough to be carried, and he learned early that a transit is a precise and important instrument, and that his mother moved through the world with an authority that was not borrowed from anyone. Joel taught him cattle and horses and fence, and the specific, patient relationship with the land that was the core of everything Joel knew. By the time Edmund was 3, Nora was expecting again, and this time the ranch had expanded to include a second section of land to the north, purchased from a homesteader who had concluded that Wyoming winter was not compatible with his particular temperament, and a bunkhouse where 2 hired hands named Reese and Domingo kept the operation running smoothly through the seasons when the work exceeded what 2 people could manage. The second child was a girl. They named her Clara, and the name was Joel's suggestion, and Nora understood why without needing to ask and accepted it as the thing it was, the quiet, respectful acknowledgement of a woman who had been told the truth and deserved to be remembered kindly for how she had received it. The years moved with the specific quality of a life that is fully inhabited, not smooth or unchallenged, but present and real and built on something that holds. Nora continued her survey work, adapting its scale and timing to the rhythms of the ranch and the children, building a professional reputation that extended past Carbon County into the neighboring territories. She trained 2 assistants in subsequent years, young men from the area who wanted to learn the trade, and she trained them the way her father had trained her, with high standards and the assumption that they were capable of meeting them. She won a contract from the territorial government in 1888 to survey the boundary of a new county formation, which was the largest public survey contract awarded in Wyoming that year, and which she completed on schedule and under budget. When the survey report was presented to the territorial legislature, a representative from Laramie County asked the Land Office Commissioner whether the surveyor would be available for future government work, and the commissioner said yes and gave her name, and the representative said, "That is a woman," in a tone that suggested he was raising a concern, and the commissioner said, "That is also the best survey report I have received in 8 years." And the representative did not have a productive response to that. Joel heard about this exchange from the land agent in Rawlins, who had heard it from a colleague in Cheyenne, and he came home that evening and told Nora what had been said, and she listened with the composed expression she brought to all information, and then she said, "Good. I need the work." He looked at her across the dinner table with their 2 children making the particular noise children make at the end of a long day, and the fire going, and the wind working its way around the corners of the house that he had built by himself 7 years before she arrived, and that was considerably better since she had been in it. And he felt the thing he had been feeling since January of that first year. The thing that was not simple enough to be called happiness and not complicated enough to be called anything else, only it was very large and very steady and did not appear to be going anywhere. "Nora," he said. She looked at him. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Then tell me," she said. "When you walked through that door in October of 1883, he said, "I was the most self-sufficient, miserable man in Carbon County. I had everything I had decided I needed, and nothing that I had decided I could not afford to want. I had made a very clean, very logical, very stupid set of decisions about what kind of life was possible for me." He paused. "You did not ask my permission to dismantle any of that. You just showed up with your transit and your field notes and your insufferable competence, and you took apart every argument I had and replaced it with something true." Clara had fallen asleep against his arm. Edmund was pushing beans around his plate in a contemplative way. Nora was looking at Joel with an expression that was fully open and fully present and very bright. "The insufferable part," she said. "Is that how you would describe it?" "Extraordinary," he said, "is the right word." "That is better," she said. "I love you," he said plainly, the way he said all the important things. "I loved you before I knew what to call it, and I have not found a day since when I did not. I want you to know that clearly." Nora Chandler Kendrick, who had been told many things by many people across her formidable professional career, and had received most of them with the composed intelligence that was her great strength, looked at her husband across the dinner table in the house she had moved into without permission and subsequently made irreversibly hers, and let her face be entirely, simply, unguardedly what it was. "I love you too," she said. "I have since approximately the South Pasture Survey, though I strongly denied it to myself for several weeks afterward." "The South Pasture Survey," he said. "That was only our 4th day." "I was aware of that," she said. "It was inconvenient." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and Edmund looked up from his beans and observed his parents with the equanimity of a child who has grown up in the specific atmosphere of two people who are genuinely glad the other exists, and whose baseline understanding of what adults can be to each other includes respect and competence and honest words, and a warmth that fills the available space without requiring any performance. Outside, the October wind was moving through the high grass of the north pasture with the same sound it made every year at this season, the same cold certainty coming down from the ridge, the same stars over the limestone shelf where Nora had first taken her elevation readings 3 years and a lifetime ago. The fence posts Joel had driven into the south pasture boundary stood where they had stood since October 1883, in exactly the location the original deed specified, unmoved. The gas hazard in the creek cut remained fenced and marked with a cedar post, and a warning tied to it in Nora's handwriting that she had insisted on placing there the morning after they had confirmed the problem, so nobody who came after would have to learn it the hard way. Edmund eventually went to bed without significant protest, which was not his standard operating procedure, but represented a merciful exception that both his parents appreciated. Clara remained asleep against Joel's arm with the total confidence of a child, who has never had any reason to doubt the solidity of the arms holding her. Nora and Joel sat by the fire after the children were settled, and the conversation moved where it always moved, between the practical and the real, between the survey schedules and the cattle prices, and the slow unfolding of a shared life that had not been planned and had not been invited, and had turned out to be the most precise, most solid, most abundantly worth having structure either of them had ever had the improbable fortune to build. The hard life was still hard. The land was still unforgiving in the ways that land in high country is always unforgiving. There were seasons that tested the margins and winters that tested the structures and years that required everything both of them had to give. None of that changed because two people had found each other in it. What changed was the simple, foundational, enormous fact that they faced it together, which is not a small thing in any life, and is, in a hard one, everything. Joel Kendrick had said he would never ask anyone to share the hard life he led. Nora Chandler had not waited to be asked. And the life they made from that particular arithmetic was one that neither of them, looking back across the years of it, had the slightest interest in trading for a simpler one. The ridge above the ranch was still visible from the south window on clear days, its limestone edge sharp against the sky in the way it had been since before any of them arrived and would be long after. Nora had measured it and recorded it, and understood its exact dimensions in the way of someone who knew that a thing must be measured before it can be properly valued. She had measured a great many things in her life. The ones that mattered most could not be measured at all. She had found all of them in the same place, in the house she had walked into without an invitation, in the company of a man who had needed someone to move in without one, in the middle of the hard, beautiful, irreplaceable life they had built from nothing but competence and honesty, and the specific, stubborn refusal of two people to let fear be the last word on what was possible. And the last word, if there was one, was not spoken with any ceremony or any flourish. It was spoken the way most true things in a good life are spoken, quietly in the middle of an ordinary evening, with the fire going and the children asleep, and the land outside as vast and cold and magnificent as it had ever been. It was simply, "This is enough. This is more than enough. This is exactly right."